What should have been the happiest day of my life turned into something I'll never forget, but for all the wrong reasons. Standing at the altar, filled with hope, I was ready to pledge my love to Ezra. Instead, my father's fury shattered everything. Before I knew it, he stormed toward me and, to everyone's shock, struck me on the head with his shoe. "Why on earth would you marry a truck mechanic?" he shouted, his voice full of contempt. "He's a man of no worth." In that moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Shock filled every face, and the festive joy began crumbling into chaos. But what followed was even more unexpected than the attack itself. My name is Serafina Silas, and I never thought my wedding day, something I dreamed of for years, would turn into a nightmare. Now, as I look back on everything that happened, I realize this journey wasn't just about love. It became the lesson in strength, independence, and learning to stand up for myself. It all began in the vibrant city of Seattle, Washington. I had always envisioned my wedding day as one of pure joy, a celebration of love and commitment. At 30 years old, I thought I had my life together. I was a passionate professor who enjoyed inspiring my students to reach their full potential, just as I pushed myself to do the same. In Ezra, I found everything I had ever hoped for. At 35, he was a hardworking truck mechanic with a kind heart. His love was unwavering, and his presence in my life made me feel supported and secure. Ezra wasn't just my partner. He was my best friend. I knew he would always stand by my side no matter what. Our relationship had grown like the flowers in the very garden where we decided to exchange our vows. It was a sunny day, the sky glowing with warmth, and everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Friends and family gathered, filling the garden with laughter and joy, but beneath it all, I felt a heavy tension in my heart. The source of that tension was my father, Silas. A successful businessman, he had never accepted Ezra, and he didn't hesitate to remind me why. He was convinced that Ezra's profession was beneath me. "A truck mechanic," he'd mutter with disdain, "is not a suitable match for a woman like you." He didn't see the man I loved. He only saw someone who, in his eyes, lacked ambition. "Serafina, you need someone who can elevate your status, not drag you down," he told me repeatedly, his tone always firm and full of disappointment. But love had led me here, and I believed it would be enough to change his heart. So, I stood at the altar, praying that my father would set his judgments aside. As Ezra and I exchanged vows, his eyes sparkled with joy. His voice was steady and sure as he promised, "I'll love you and stand by you every single day." For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, my father would finally accept the man I had chosen. But the real test was still to come. After the ceremony, the reception was lively. Guests danced, laughed, and clinked glasses, celebrating our union. But despite the joyful energy, the tension between my father and me lingered like a dark cloud. I noticed him standing alone, arms crossed, his face locked in a grim expression. Determined to break the ice, I approached him with a forced smile. "Isn't it beautiful, Dad?" I asked, hoping to find a glimmer of approval in his eyes.
He scoffed.
"It's just a show, Serafina.
You deserve better than this."
His words hit me hard, but I tried to brush them off. Ezra noticed my shift in mood and reached for my hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Ignore him, Kathy," he whispered with warmth. "This is our day." But as the night wore on, the tension boiled over. When my father stood to give a toast, I hoped he would offer a kind word, some sign of acceptance. Instead, his voice was sharp and cutting. "I am deeply disappointed in this marriage," he began, his words slicing through the cheerful atmosphere. "I don't understand how marrying a truck mechanic will ever make my daughter happy." "You're settling, Serafina. I expected more from you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My face flushed with embarrassment, and my heart sank. I wanted to defend Ezra, to shout that love was more important than social status, but the words wouldn't come. Ezra, however, didn't hesitate. He stood tall, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I love Serafina, and I will always respect and support her. That's what really matters." But my father sneered, dismissing Ezra's words with a bitter laugh. Love isn't enough to build a life on. You'll ruin her life. Mark my words. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Dad, please, I begged, struggling to keep my voice steady. This is our wedding day. Before I could say more, everything spiraled out of control. My father, consumed with rage, yanked off his shoe and struck me on the head. The room went still, every guest frozen in disbelief. The pain wasn't just physical, it was the betrayal that cut the deepest. Tears welled in my eyes, and I felt the weight of every horrified stare around me. Ezra reacted immediately, his face dark with anger. How dare you touch her, he shouted, his voice booming through the stunned silence. He lunged toward my father, and in an instant, chaos erupted. Family members rushed forward, trying to pull them apart as the scene turned into a frenzy. My mother hurried to my side, her eyes filled with sorrow. Serafina, I'm so sorry, she whispered, wrapping her arms around me. But her embrace felt fragile against the storm that had been unleashed. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the sound of police sirens cut through the night air. One of my aunts had called the authorities, and within minutes, officers arrived, pulling my father away from the chaos. His face twisted with rage, he shouted curses as they escorted him out of the garden. I watched, heartbroken, as what was supposed to be a day of joy dissolved into a nightmare. Guests began to leave, murmuring words of sympathy and confusion. I turned to Ezra, who stood beside me with a split lip and eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. He wrapped me in a tight embrace, his voice heavy with emotion. I'm so sorry, Serafina. This isn't what I wanted for us. In that moment, standing amid the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of our lives, I knew our journey was far from over. Waking up the morning after my disastrous wedding felt like stepping into a fog of emotions. The sunlight streamed into our small apartment in Seattle, but its warmth did nothing to ease the cold ache in my heart. I ran my fingers over my scalp, wincing at the soreness from where my father had hit me with his shoe. That sting wasn't just physical, it was a painful reminder of how quickly joy had turned into heartbreak. Ezra was already awake, pacing the living room, his hands clenched into fists. His expression was a storm of frustration. Serafina, we can't just let this slide, he said, his voice firm, though I could hear the concern underneath. I nodded slowly, staring at my trembling hands. He was right. We couldn't ignore what had happened. But the thought of standing up to my father again filled me with dread. What are we supposed to do, Ezra? I whispered, barely able to get the words out. I've spent my whole life hoping for his approval. Ezra stopped pacing and knelt down beside me, his hands gently clasping mine. Your father hit you on your wedding day, he said, his voice soft but determined. That's not love, Kathy. We have to stand up for ourselves, for you. His words sank deep into my heart. For years, I had held on to the hope that my father would one day accept me. But it was becoming clear that waiting for his approval was a dead end. A new resolve started to build inside me. You're right, I murmured, my voice gaining strength. We need to do something. We can't let this control our lives anymore. With that, we decided to take action. Our first plan was to gather support from family members who had witnessed the chaos at the wedding. If they stood with us, it would make it harder for my father to deny what he'd done. The thought of confronting my family made my pulse quicken, but I knew it was necessary. Over the next few days, I made phone calls to key relatives, Juliet, Uncle Atlas, and my cousin Isadora. To my surprise, their reactions were far more supportive than I had expected. Juliet's voice was warm with sympathy when she said, Serafina, we've all seen how controlling your father can be. It's about time someone stood up to him. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting from my chest. For so long, I had felt isolated, believing I was the only one struggling under my father's influence. But with every call I made, I realized that wasn't true. Each conversation uncovered new stories of how his behavior had affected others. I've always felt intimidated by him, my cousin Isadora admitted during one call. He has this way of making everyone feel small. With every story, a clearer picture emerged. My father's toxic behavior wasn't just my personal burden. It had cast a shadow over many lives. This wasn't just about my wedding day anymore. It was about breaking free from a cycle of control and emotional abuse that had lasted far too long. One evening, Ezra and I sat together, going through the notes I had taken from these conversations. The more we uncovered, the more determined we became to take a stand. "Do you think we should consider legal action?" Ezra asked, his tone serious. I hesitated, my stomach knotting with anxiety. The idea of dragging this out into a legal battle felt overwhelming. "I just want peace," I admitted softly. "I don't want this to consume our lives." Ezra nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "We'll do whatever feels right for you, Serafina. But we can't let him get away with this." After much discussion, we decided to seek legal advice. A friend recommended Mrs. Sanders, a compassionate and experienced lawyer. When Ezra and I walked into her office, I felt a mixture of nerves and hope. Mrs. Sanders greeted us with a kind smile. "I'm here to help, Serafina," she said gently. "Tell me everything that happened." As I recounted the events of my wedding day, a strange sense of empowerment began to rise within me. Mrs. Sanders listened attentively, jotting down notes as I spoke. "You have a solid case," she said confidently when I finished. "With so many witnesses, it will be hard for him to deny what happened. But be prepared, this might get ugly. Once it becomes public, things could escalate." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I understand," I said, my heart pounding. This was my chance to reclaim my life, to set boundaries not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under my father's control. In the following weeks, our lives became a whirlwind of planning and emotional turmoil. I never imagined I would be gathering evidence against my own father, but with Ezra by my side, I felt ready to face the challenge. He was my anchor, keeping me grounded through every difficult step. We met with more family members, piecing together a fuller picture of my father's behavior over the years. Even my usually reserved Uncle Atlas opened up during one conversation. "Your father has always had a temper," he confessed. I wish I had spoken up sooner. It's time we put an end to this. With each new story, my determination grew stronger. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about stopping a pattern of behavior that had gone on far too long. One afternoon, I met Juliet at a cozy cafe. As we sipped our coffee, she reached across the table and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, Serafina," she said. "You deserve to live without fear. We'll be here for you, no matter what." Her words filled me with hope, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this fight. As I left the cafe that day, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. I was ready to stand up for myself and take back control of my life. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I wasn't walking it alone. With Ezra by my side and the support of my family, I felt stronger than ever. But even with all the preparation, I could feel the tension building. Each passing day brought us closer to the inevitable confrontation with my father. The weight of that moment loomed heavy on my heart. Still, for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose. The path before me was daunting, but I was ready to face it head-on. It was time to fight for my freedom and reclaim the life I deserved. I was no longer the quiet daughter, waiting for approval that would never come. I had stepped into a new role, a woman determined to reclaim her life. Ezra and I spent endless hours strategizing for the inevitable confrontation with my father. Late one evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, Ezra looked at me, concern etched in his eyes. "Are you sure about this, Serafina?" he asked gently. "Once we confront him, there's no going back." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I know, Ezra," I replied, steadying my voice. "But I can't keep living in fear. This isn't just for me. It's for everyone he's hurt. I have to do this." The following week, we set up a meeting with my father at his office. I knew this confrontation wouldn't be easy. My father thrived in environments where he held all the power, and walking into his domain would be a challenge. To prepare, I chose my outfit carefully, something that made me feel both confident and strong. As I stood in front of the mirror, I reminded myself, I wasn't just his daughter, I was a woman who deserved respect. When we arrived at Silas's office, the tension was thick in the air. The walls were adorned with awards and photos of my father standing beside influential figures, a stark reminder of the authority he wielded. Ezra and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement that we were ready to face whatever lay ahead. "Dad, we need to talk," I said firmly as I stepped into his office. My voice didn't waver. He looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face, but it quickly vanished, replaced by an icy glare. "Catherine, what is this about?" he asked sharply, folding his arms across his chest. I glanced at Ezra, who gave me a reassuring nod. "It's about what happened at my wedding. You can't treat people like that, especially your own daughter," I said, standing tall. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "You chose to marry that mechanic. You've brought shame on this family," he snapped, his voice rising with anger. "Shame?" I shot back, feeling my pulse quicken. "I love Ezra, and you didn't even give him a chance. Instead, you attacked me." My heart was pounding, but I was resolute. He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "You think you know better than me? You're just a child, playing house." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I refused to back down.
No, Dad.
"I'm an adult, and it's time you recognize that. Your abusive behavior has hurt more than just me." My father's face flushed with anger, but I pressed on, my courage growing with every word. "I've talked to family members who saw what happened at the wedding. They're standing with me." He sneered, his face dark with rage. "They're just jealous of our success." I stepped closer, feeling a surge of strength. "This isn't about success, Dad. It's about respect. You've bullied us all for too long, and I won't let it continue. I deserve to live my life free from your control." Ezra moved beside me, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "Silas, this isn't just about Serafina. It's about breaking the cycle of abuse that has impacted your entire family." The room fell silent. For a moment, my father sat in stunned disbelief, struggling to process the shift in power. His anger flickered, then dimmed as the weight of our words settled on him. "You think you can just walk away from this family?" he asked bitterly. "You think you can take me down?" "It's not about walking away," I replied, my voice calm but unwavering. "It's about breaking free from your toxic behavior. I'm taking legal action. You can't treat people this way and expect no consequences." His face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I feared he would lash out again. But instead, he slumped in his chair, deflated. The reality of the confrontation seemed to sink in, and the man who once loomed so large in my life suddenly seemed smaller. "You wouldn't dare," he muttered weakly. "I already have," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." In that moment, a wave of liberation washed over me. I had stood up to my father, confronted his abuse, and reclaimed my independence. It was a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under his control. As we left his office, the weight I had carried for so long seemed to lift off my shoulders. Ezra wrapped his arms around me, holding me close. "You did it, Serafina," he whispered, pride glowing in his eyes. "You stood up to him." Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me," I whispered, my voice full of emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." That day marked a turning point in my life. I knew that breaking free from my father's grip wouldn't happen overnight, but I was ready for the fight ahead. With Ezra by my side and the support of my family, I felt stronger than ever. The weeks following the confrontation were both empowering and exhausting. I had taken a stand, but the weight of that decision still lingered. Ezra and I continued gathering evidence and testimonies from family members, each conversation strengthening my resolve. I could feel the tide turning in my favor, and it gave me hope. One afternoon, Ezra and I sat in the living room, surrounded by papers, notes, and legal documents. The room was cluttered, but it represented progress, a step toward reclaiming my life. "Every story we've collected shows the same pattern," I said, flipping through the pages. "It's not just me. He's been hurting people for years." Ezra nodded. And now it's time to put an end to it. I smiled, grateful for his unwavering support. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew I wasn't alone. With Ezra and my family by my side, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The confrontation with my father was just the beginning, but for the first time, I felt a sense of freedom and clarity. I had chosen to fight for my happiness, and I was determined to reclaim the life I deserved, on my own terms. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was Juliet. "Catherine, I heard about your confrontation with your father," she said, her voice warm with pride. "I'm so proud of you. We need to talk about how we can support you through this." Her words meant the world to me. Juliet had always been a source of strength in my life, and knowing she was in my corner gave me the courage I needed to keep moving forward. We arranged a family meeting with those willing to stand up against my father and support our case. When we gathered in Juliet's cozy living room, I felt the energy shift. I could see the determination in their eyes as they shared their stories of how my father's behavior had hurt them. "It's time for a change," Uncle Atlas declared. "We can't let him think he can control us anymore." Their support felt like a lifeline. With this newfound strength, Ezra and I met with Mrs. Sanders again to plan the next steps. Her professional yet compassionate demeanor reassured me as we laid out our legal strategy. "You've got a solid case," she said with a nod. "But be prepared. Your father will fight back." I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the battle ahead. "I'm ready," I said firmly. "I need to hold him accountable." With every step forward, I felt stronger. Ezra, my family, and I gathered testimonies, documented past incidents of my father's abuse, and detailed how his behavior had impacted all of us. It was a long, exhausting process, but with each conversation, I felt a part of my self-healing. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. My nerves were raw as we entered the courtroom, but I felt Ezra's hand on my back, grounding me. "You've got this, Catherine," he whispered softly. "No matter what happens, I'm right here with you." As I looked across the courtroom, I saw my father sitting calmly, though the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior was evident. I closed my eyes for a moment, gathered my strength, and reminded myself why I was here. To tell the truth, Mrs. Sanders presented our case with clarity and passion. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "This isn't just about what happened on my wedding day," I began. "It's about years of emotional and physical abuse that have gone unchallenged. I refuse to be silent any longer." Though fear gripped me, the presence of my family and Ezra filled me with determination. I shared everything, the outburst at my wedding and the years of manipulation that had weighed me down. As I spoke, I noticed the judge nodding, a flicker of hope sparking within me. My father tried to downplay his actions, but his words rang hollow. The testimonies from my family painted a vivid picture of the fear, control, and emotional scars that had haunted us for years. Finally, the judge spoke. "It is evident that there has been a long-standing pattern of abuse in this family. It's time for that cycle to end." Tears welled in my eyes as the judge ruled in our favor. A wave of liberation washed over me. I had stood up to my father and reclaimed my voice after years of silence and fear. As soon as we stepped outside the courtroom, I turned to Ezra and threw my arms around him, tears streaming down my face. "We did it," I cried, the weight of all the pain and fear finally lifting from my shoulders. Ezra held me close, his voice filled with emotion. "I knew you could do it, Serafina. I'm so proud of you." In the days that followed, I focused on healing and rebuilding my life. With Ezra by my side, we explored new adventures and found joy in helping others. We volunteered in community service, creating safe spaces for people who had experienced struggles like mine. Each small act of kindness felt like a step toward reclaiming my happiness. Looking back on my journey, I realized that I had not only broken free from my father's grip, I had found my inner strength. The road had been long and painful, but it led me to a place of empowerment and peace. My story wasn't just about overcoming adversity, it was about finding my voice, reclaiming my life, and embracing the future with open arms. I was no longer defined by the expectations of others or trapped by fear. I was finally living for myself, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free.